Peace. What's up, everybody? Welcome back to I Mix What I Like. Again, I'm Jared Ball, very happy to be your host. And I'm very, very happy to be hosting this particular discussion, something some of you have heard me talk a little bit about here and there. Been waiting anxiously for it to talk about this new book with the author who's joining us here today, Professor Marcel Rosa-Salas, who is the author of Total Market American, Race, Data, and Advertising. One, big congratulations on the book.
Thank you.
I love it. I think you've done something remarkable here. But welcome, and please, if you would, say a word or two about who you are and what start with the initial question. What brought you to this topic? But yeah,
Yes.
welcome.
Thank you so much. And this is high praise coming from you because, as you know, your work is cited in the book and was such a big inspiration and ideas that I drew from consistently. So thank you for laying some important groundwork for me throughout the process. Yes. So I'm Marcel Rosa-Salas. How do I describe myself? Proud Brooklynite. I'm a mother, daughter, partner, friend, anthropologist, filmmaker, uh, ex-professor, transition out of academia for many reasons we could talk about if you want, but now I'm involved in a bunch of different like entrepreneurial endeavors. So this book is kind of my last chapter in academia and my life in that realm of the world. This book, Total Market American, is really a conversation with myself in a lot of ways, and I always go back to childhood and some of the childhood fixations and obsessions that maybe we had sort of bubble up into what we're doing in the present day. And I really think that this book is the manifestation of so many questions that have been on my mind since childhood. But to give a bit of an overview about the book itself, it's really focuses on a part of advertising that most of us never get exposure to, but I think really has a profound impact on all of us. And that's really the behind the scenes labor, particularly in research and strategy, that ultimately gets to decide who is imagined as a target consumer and how this kind of labor of decision making and theorizing is done. So I think there's been so much amazing scholarship in the past that has asked really important questions and have done really phenomenal analyses about images, commercial images, and sort of the information about race that we receive from advertising. I have an industry background in advertising and marketing as well. So given that background that I had, when I started doing the research, I wanted to go a layer deeper and ask a different question, which I think the book addresses throughout, which is how do racial representations that we see in advertising in the end product, how do those get manufactured and made in the first place? And so that question that I had led me inside ad agencies and media agencies, also a host of different kinds of industry conferences all across the US. And I spent time studying and doing the work, ultimately, alongside the people that are called brand strategists and media planners. Their job is to essentially do a bunch of social theorizing to make human beings legible to corporations. And they conduct a bunch of research and analysis about people and translate it into what is known in like industry jargon as consumer insights. And these consumer insights then become sort of the conceptual direction of ad campaigns. And so the book itself traces how theories about race get turned into commercial expertise within the American advertising industry. I could talk a bit about what led me to the work, but I'll stop there to see.
No, I do want you to. I do want you to, because, and I'm assuming that would have to include some discussion of the internships and the conferences, because I thought that was. I don't know. I found like I think I was having a kind of positive jealousy about that. Like I because it seems like, and then maybe you can, it seems like in reading your book that you were much earlier on in being clear about where you wanted to go with your work, certainly than I was. So you seem to have lay out, and I loved the methodology that.
Thanks.
So I definitely wanted you to talk about that because I certainly never interned at ad agencies and went to some of these conferences you talk about, which I definitely want to come back to as well. So yeah, please talk about what led you to it, and if you would, some of that experience, because it's fascinating.
Thank you. Yeah, the field work was quite a journey, but as I mentioned before, I did have previous work experience at big brands. One of my first jobs out after undergraduate was at Red Bull, and my role was a culture marketing manager. So my job was to, and Red Bull's a really fascinating but kind of like pioneering brand in the like contemporary capitalist propaganda space as it comes to brand, not only selling product, but becoming a whole media empire where the product is second to the brand story and the people that they want to represent the product.
No, and in world football, they even talk about Red Bull's influence as a culture of football. So it's
Yes.
way past a product. Yeah.
Yes. So that was like my marketing training ground. And it also burned me out entirely and kind of propelled me to do my PhD. But I think that I knew that if I wanted to understand how the kind of the racial epistemology of advertising, how it functioned, I knew that I had to do the work, and I also knew that in advertising, anthropology as a discipline and sort of the mystique that it has about understanding cultures and behaviors and kind of the take it for granted norms, corporations really like that. It's a very seductive promise, anthropology and ethnography. It's really been taken up, whether we want to say it's actually anthropology or not. I'm not very precious about that, but it that kind of gave me entry point. Being a PhD student in at NYU doing culture anthropology was actually helped me gain access into a lot of the internships because I was able to actually position myself as an intern, an unpaid intern. So kind of a value exchange, if you will. So that worked in my favor as a researcher for sure. But I think that the interest in multicultural advertising and kind of like the racial dimensions of advertising, as I said, started in childhood. Like it goes really far back for me. Um,
I know,
I
right?
think
Because fashion plate, right?
yes, nameplates. I think too much to my parents' like dismay, I was like a very brand obsessed kid, like hyper materialistic. And my parents, they joke about this, they laugh about this a lot because the obsession with consumer culture at such a young age was veering on the level of absurdity that my parents were like, where's this coming from? But I think I always point to this example when I talk about the genesis of this work because I think it speaks to just how deeply I was feeling the emotions and kind of the psychological transformation that brands, that advertising exists to elicit. And I was experiencing that as some of my earliest, most formative memories. And I also had a sense though that there were people behind this. And so from a very early age, I was curious about who are these people that have the power to make me feel things about Folgers and make my mom beg my mom in the grocery store to buy Folgers. So there's that piece of brand culture being this kind of salient part of how I understood my place in the world and kind of these enduring questions about who am I and where do I belong. For me, brands and advertising have always been that cultural material that have been very predominant in how I understand myself and kind of unpacking the messiness of that as I sort of become much more aware and political around my like sort of consciousness of capitalism and class consciousness. But there's that piece. But I think there's also this which I don't really address that. I just partially in the book, but I think it's this kind of ongoing ambivalence and questions about my own racial identity and my own confusion about where I belong in U.S. racial cosmology, if you want to call it that. I'm from New York, as I probably proudly proclaimed as one of the first things I said on
Well,
here.
Brooklyn specifically, of
You
course,
know,
right?
you
Yes,
can't,
yeah.
you kind of have to claim it. Brooklyn born and raised. So that's kind of like my first identity. But my parents, I have ancestry in Puerto Rico. So there's this idea about Puerto Ricanness that gets kind of filtered through this experience of New York as being an extension of Puerto Rico, but also very disconnected to the island itself. And so I've always been felt quite like ambivalent about categories that the state has placed me in, like Hispanic or Latina. They've never really resonated with me, for all that many of these categories kind of obscure and oversimplify and flatten. But I've always felt quite frustrated that I've been forced to ascribe myself an identity so defined by colonialism, by anti-blackness, by anti-indigeneity, and I've never really wanted anything to do with it. So I think these personal questions I've had for my whole life about how do these categories get their taken for granted power? How do we get trained to understand Hispanicness, right? If we want to call it that in my case, as natural instead of historically and politically made? And what role does our consumer culture have to play in making these categories feel, a part of my sense of self? So that's kind of the personal piece. And then that led me into some of my undergraduate studies where I was trying to figure out, very from a practical standpoint, how do I apply these interests that I have into a job? And so that's when I literally did a Google search one day, right when I was about to become a senior in college, and came across multicultural marketing as an industry, came upon a bunch of different PDF reports proclaiming, facts and figures about who Latinas are, how they behave, how they think. And I was taken aback that there was an entire corporate industry of knowledge production that existed basically to sell with certainty facts and figures to Coca-Cola, to McDonald's, to get people like me to buy more Coca-Cola and McDonald's. So that was the impetus that made me then pursue an internship as an undergraduate at a multicultural advertising agency. That's where I got my legs in understanding that strategy as a corporate cultural form of work even existed, that there were workers within advertising whose job it was to be racial theorists in a sense. And that really set me on my path to the book that we have finally published as of October.
And I should say Duke University Press. So, and again, congratulations on that. Even though you've wrote, I mean, I guess you don't care anymore leaving academia, but I still think it's important to note. And I started thinking, well, the whole Brooklyn and hip hop. I started thinking of the Jay-Z, grand opening, grand closing. Like you've drop this incredible work, and then it's like I'm out. And then I'm moving, I'm moving
Mic
on
drop.
to bigger. Yeah, exactly. And it is a mic drop. The book, so as I always want to start, I increasingly like to say, as just to ease my own stress, and just to remind people that for whatever failings occur in my interview of our guest, please don't let that deter you from checking out the book and seeing for yourself how good it is. So I just don't want anybody to be like, "Oh, Jared, his interview, he didn't, something wrong with him, And then so please read the book. It is phenomenally researched and written, and you make so many important points in fact, let's start with one of the ones you just sort of touched on, this relationship. How did I write it here? How does your work engage or define or interpret the overlaps in settler colonialism, advertising, and racial construction? The American advertising's racial information system, as you describe it.
Yes.
How does that work exactly? And I just want to, and even in your the a part of the title of this, what is it, chapter 2, the production of racial expertise, like based on these settler colonially inspired racial categories. So yeah, could you talk a little bit about this overlap of settler colonialism, advertising, and racial construction?
Yes, sure, sure. So again, for every campaign, every ad made, that we see on YouTube that we quickly, skip, there is a group of people who sit in meetings day after day and labor over decision making and questions about who will be considered a target consumer of that particular piece of media, and also where that media is placed. So there's the advertising creative agency piece where the brand strategist exists, and their role is to compile and do research of a variety of different methodologies. And then there's the media planners at media agencies who basically do that process again, but decide where is the best channel for an advertisement to be placed so it's seen by the target audience. So a huge part of the research for the book takes place in this division of the industry, where a lot of their work, as I said earlier, is devoted to this type of corporatized social theorizing about humanity, about what it means to be human, about the significance and meaning and placement of brands in people's lives. This is conducted through dedicated efforts at research and measurement. And essentially, these kinds of dossiers of information are presented in slide decks and PDF reports about attempts to get into people's inner world, into their fears and motivations, and put them to use into the creative storytelling of advertisement. And ultimately, the quest is to make persuasion more scalable and more effective. So we know that advertising in the US can't escape the racialized social world it exists in. And because of this, it has inherited what I've observed and what I've practiced as someone who's interned in the industry. It's inherited this very race forward common sense that assumes that groups are essentially different in ways that are measurable and predictable. And obviously advertising didn't invent this, but it operationalizes it, and it puts it to work for brands. So when I talk about the advertising industry's racial information system, what I'm referring to is multidimensional. It's ecosystems of people, of the theories they use, of the technologies and the practices that turn racial theories into market knowledge that then circulates as expertise to advertisers and other important stakeholders, whether that's brand managers, a bunch of different people within the ecosystem. So these kinds of racial theories about what it means to be human, and ultimately who people are, their cultural practices, what they want, they get professionalized and commodified in American advertising for this quest of getting consumers to do what corporations want, which is view that video, click that ad, buy that product. And so it shows up in a lot of the work that you're familiar with, in terms of these kind of audience measurement reports, the buying power reports, the Nielsen's, the Selig reports of the world, the Pew Research Centers even. So audience rating and segmentation data, these proprietary agency research that sometimes multicultural agencies develop and sell to promote their expertise and services to brands. Trend reports, what else? Software that has kind of racial logics, consumer research software that has racial logics built into how data is cut up and then is able to be used by strategists. So when I think about the overlap between settler colonialism and advertising and this kind of production of racial categories, I keep coming back to this obsession with classification and how classifications aren't just a way to describe people. We know that it's not like an innocent practice. It's a governing technology. Once you can name, count, and sort people, you can then build a hierarchy that gets then transplanted and built into the infrastructure of everyday life. And that ultimately determines who gets rights and resources, and ultimately whose life is treated as expendable. So I think that advertising is part of this system of racial knowledge production that is part of reproducing this seemingly naturalness of racial categories and giving them this kind of like institutional power and heft to make them look rational, normal, and even faded. And of course, racial categories can't be separated from capitalism. Capitalism has always had a stake in the practice and the labor of racial theorizing. And so it's, to me, it's no surprise that American advertising, the very business infrastructure as we know of it, is built on a racially segregated vision of the American public.
No, absolutely, and there are so many overlaps in terms of the politics, the funding, the ideology involved in the trajectory of the research, in advertising, in psychological warfare, in I mean, there's in everything in between. So it. So I messed up again because I intended to do this at the beginning, but as we record this, it's the day after Steve Biko's birthday. And Biko, of course, the Azanian or South African legendary freedom fighter who wrote "I Write What I Like," a column whose name I pay homage to with "I Mix What I Like" for several puns, um, including my own racial mixture. But he wrote. I just was thinking about him in advance of our discussion and was just thumbing through this collection. I write what I like, and almost haphazard, just sort of going through notes I had, and found two things that he said here real quick, 50 some odd years ago, that I think fit very well into what you've already said and what I'm inviting you to what you yeah to talk more about. But just quickly, he said, we believe that alongside, he's talking about the role of the press in struggle here. And he says, we believe that alongside Radio Bantu, most of the, no, he said, I'm sorry. SASO, that is the students, South African Students Organization he was working with, rejects the press and believes in having as little to do with it as possible. The press is largely directed at white society or the so-called electorate, whose values are laced with racial prejudice against black people. Equally, SASO rejects the black press, which up to now has been largely controlled and some of it financed by government institutions. We believe alongside Radio Bantu, most of the black press is being used as instruments of propaganda to get people to swallow most of the unbalanced and inflated stories about what the government is doing for the Bantus or for the Indians or for the coloreds. So I thought that was interesting in terms of not only his recognition, as I would understand it in the context of our discussion, that advertising and political ruling elites have so much more to do with the content of commercial press, black, white, or other, or Hispanic marketing media, as you talk about as well. And that they're very much interested in maintaining those colonially inspired categories of, in his case, black, Indian, and colored, which you are talking a lot about in your work as well. And then just lastly, just he says also, he's talked about why black consciousness was so important in rejecting the colonial definitions of black in South Africa. And he says these are concepts which the black consciousness approach wishes to eradicate from the black man's mind before our society is driven to chaos by irresponsible people from Coca-Cola and hamburger cultural backgrounds. So again, I just thought it was interesting, even unintentionally, Biko was speaking, 50 years in advance of so much of what you and so many of the others that you cite in your book are dealing with. That we have that, and I did want you to say, if you would, another word or two about that so much of what Biko was saying then is in response to categorization inspired by colonization to better determine, if in other words, to better define phenomena and have it act in the desired manner, as Huey Newton and them said, right? But if you have the power to define people as specific racial categories and what it means to be in those racialized categories, then it's easier to predict from their point of view what the behavior would be that you can then market to better have better results and impact on your advertising. So working back from what I just said, does that make sense? Am I and how does your work support that or challenge what I've just said, or add to what Biko was saying 50 years ago?
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, we know that racial categories have always been about prediction, creating these containers of meaning to create order, hierarchy, and control, and ultimately use these types of theories about what it means to be human as a conceptual shortcut so that we can, for with some degree of certainty, we so believe, know where to place people before they even have before we even give them the dignity to be who they are, outside of the kind of idea about them that we are ascribing to them. So I think that absolutely tracks with how I observed and practiced in many ways, and saw the types of theories about race be circulated, produced, bought, and sold within advertising. Because what you'll see is certain truisms about different racialized groups be bought and sold and traded as basically like social facts within the industry. Like, Hispanic moms are cultural trendsetters, or Black consumers, and mind you, Black as the capacious category that it is taken for granted as that. Black consumers are cultural trendsetters, which has a degree of truth to it in the American cultural economy, but the underlying logic beneath it, which is what I try to get at the book and talk about with my interlocutors, is this understanding of race as this kind of embodied trait that sort of propels cultural behaviors. So the understanding of these categories often isn't being socially and historically constituted and also like changeable. I wouldn't say that that's also that's exclusive, because what's interesting too is that there are people that are working within the industry that do have more complicated, nuanced understandings of the politics of these categories and sort of the ways that we've been trained to think about them. But when they're in their roles in the industry, they know the part that they have to play and the types of adages and truisms that need to be in their pitch decks, in their presentations, in order to give populations in the United States that are devalued in so many other dimensions of life, politically, socially, to ascribe them with value, so that a company like Coca-Cola, Pepsi, McDonald's, what have you, will consider them worthy of investing marketing budgets towards.
And seeing them. I loved your discussion of being seen, and what does it mean to
Right.
be seen? Yeah, what does it in that context, what does it mean to be seen when
What does it mean to be seen?
in yeah,
Yes, I feel like we see that language, feeling seen, within the advertising industry as a way to create a kind of like moral imperative around multicultural advertising, which, by the way, is an outdated term. Even as the book has been published, so much changes, and we can talk about like why multicultural marketing as a term is kind of passe, but I use it as a shorthand here. So feeling seen in industry like discourse becomes this kind of moral imperative and kind of like political charge to get brands mobilized for the, I guess, like the social good aspect of um, investing marketing budgets into targeting racial groups as their own audiences with their value to bring to the corporate bottom line. Feeling seen refers to this sense that a company, so it refers to two things. It's a practice, and I think also kind of like a sensibility. In practice, on the advertising side, feeling seen refers to the efforts that a brand would make, whether it's hiring the right agencies, hiring the right consultants, paying for the right research, to invest in the racial expertise needed to understand populations in the US that for so long have been grossly stereotyped, denigrated in our media system, right? So there's a baseline understanding that that is a fact, and that the advertising industry has a long way to go in rectifying race ingrained racism and how people of color, again, I use all these quotes, these things in scare quotes, are portrayed. So with the acknowledgement of that, a lot of the labor that I noticed being done in multicultural advertising strategy places is basically appealing to companies that, you know, it's important that you invest in this kind of research and expertise to right those wrongs of the past, and also to gain greater consumer understanding of Hispanic moms or Black millennials in Atlanta, right? Feeling seen is then this like kind of psychological, emotional disposition that is positioned as a brand doing the right amount of research and getting the right amount of expertise about their consumer market so that that person feels like the brand really understands them. It's creating, they've done the effort to create that emotional connection, and that type of effort that is made to know the types of cultural cues, the types of music to include in an ad. A consumer seeing that in a McDonald's ad or a Nike ad will be a factor in them getting to buy. So feeling seen is this type of I think this longing for dignity that I think many of us long for in a nation that is has their foot on our necks, the boots on our necks, and appealing to our consumer culture and corporations as a route to kind of giving us that feeling of wholeness, psychological fulfillment, security, that in my view is in many parts a distraction from where we should really be directing those appeals to dignity. But feeling seen becomes this kind of rallying cry that I think not only operates in the industry, but also we see becomes a part of how many of us relate to corporations, the kind of demands that we make, you know?
I think it also impacts how we relate to each other because,
Yes.
and I'll leave this as this is for my small but wonderful audience. I will leave this as a sort of teaser and an inducement to get your copy and read Marcel's book. Because just one other little inducement, someone you reference in your book used that description of seeing me, I think, as an interpersonal microcosmic version of what you describe happens with corporations using that. In other words, it was used to disarm disagreement and criticism by saying, I just wanting me to feel, I see you, Jared. And I felt immediately, and in reading reading your book, I said, "Oh, that's exactly how I felt on an individual level." What you say here, I think, is really important about that. And then I want to use this to double back to a question that I had wanted to ask you before. To feel seen is to be interpolated by an advertiser, hailed as a valued consumer subject, recognized as important, worthy, and deserving of a message crafted just for them. In the United States, the desire reflects the market's deep influence on shaping subjectivity, intertwining consumerism with broader aspirations for social equity, respect, and political inclusion. So again, they're saying we see you, as I understand what you're saying. We see you, we
Yes.
want some freedom, some liberation. We're going to symbolically include you as a way of pacifying and alleviating some of that tension for you from that,
Mhm.
without threatening us. But so say anything in response to that you'd like, but I wanted
For
to use that to
sure.
come back to what I meant to ask you more specifically in terms of talking about the importance, because I did want you to lay out. I'm doing this out of order, so this is my fault. But I wanted you to say a little bit about the importance that advertising has to this media environment that we're in. I'm not always convinced people appreciate the extent to which advertising shapes so much of our media environment. But so with that, the scene, anything else you'd want to say, please go ahead. Yeah.
Yes, the only thing I'll add to that is if you think back to where you were in the summer of 2020, I guess
Hmm.
that's what I'm referring to it now. Um, and so much of the I think that moment was so revealing because it's no surprise that brands and advertisers were like central to the furor, the discussions, the cultural moment, if you will, around um, racial justice that happened in that period. Brands and advertisers, you will often hear that they what's going on in culture. Like how can we be part of culture? How can we be part of um, the kind of the existing conversation in a way that makes the brand feel like a partner in life. How do we insert ourselves into what people care about right now? And so, um, in that summer of 2020, like uprising, we saw um, brands not just like sit on the sidelines necessarily and like co-opt the conversation. I feel like brand culture was like integral to the social movements that were happening at that time. And I would be curious to hear what your thoughts are about this because at least from where I was sitting, I think it was the uproar in kind of broader culture and what we were seeing on social media and even at protests. It wasn't just what is the state doing, what are governments doing, but it's what is policing doing. It was what is Nike doing, what is Netflix doing, what is McDonald's doing. I feel like those types of questions of accountability to who is responsible for uh, our current kind of strife when it comes to racial injustice in this country. It wasn't necessarily in a kind of anti-capitalist reading, but it was more of like, what are the brands doing to kind of be the solve to the psychological and emotional wounds that I'm experiencing of isolation, of frustration, of grief. And so we saw brands signal their allegiance and perform these values and that were treated, I think, in many ways as very politically meaningful. And it's because in our sort of so deeply wedded consumer society, so much of our understanding, I think, about what it means to be American, what it means to be human comes through that recognition, that feeling seen through corporations as these tremendously powerful institutions. And of course, now we're seeing the pendulum swing in the other direction. I thought I had finished the book in 2023 and then everything happened with Trump getting elected again and then pendulum swings right back and so much has changed within the industry in terms of a lot of the pledges that were made to DEI or to Walmart having a center for racial equity and Target having racial justice institutes, so we see this kind of opportunistic predictably opportunistic relationship that brands have to the very grave, like social, deeply wedded social problems of our day. And obviously, corporate exploitation is so much part of this general situation. But to me, what was telling was, again, it wasn't holding the corporations accountable for the economic dimension, but it was like the social, emotional, psychological. Like, what is Netflix going to do to help ease this kind of like emotional pain? How's Netflix going to help us feel seen? Like, what is McDonald's going to do to help victims of police violence feel like their lives mattered? And to me, that was very telling.
Yeah. No, I. So one, I'm glad you did hold off and write after Trump got elected again, because the way I interpret what you're saying, at least, so I am glad to have you here to respond to this directly. But the way I'm reading it with my biased lens is that your work for me confirms my pre-existing, I think, well arrived at bias that so much of what is projected and made popular is by design meant to walk people away from any potentially radical political conclusions they might reach. So when so that all of those years of Black and other communities desiring to be seen and be included led to nothing more than George Floyd still getting killed. And then the uprising that evolved after that was met with a, a pre-established, a preconditioned corporate response to say, we will alleviate this tension by offering you more symbolic inclusion. That also then failed, which again, to me, is why you needed to come back and say some more after Trump's reelection, because all of that failed with Trump's reelection and the as you're saying, the attack on DEI. And as I will continue to credit her, my co-host on Saturdays with Renee Johnston has pointed out since the beginning of this discussion around the collapse of DEI, that ultimately the only people that benefited when DEI was initiated were a handful of, in terms of Black people, executive board seats. But in terms of the overall labor force, there had been a decline. So, in other words, DEI was nothing more than a symbolic, bourgeois, inclusive uh, uh, solve or response to the challenge of a potential uprise. So that's why so much why I've enjoyed so much your book is that it again reaffirms for me that so much of what I think unfortunately are too many who get excited by this in academia and elsewhere, the inclusiveness, the reference, the uh yeah, this the projection symbolically of all this diversity doesn't mean anything materially, and in some ways leads to a decline in the conditions because people are uh, less likely to rebel or raise certain questions or to reach certain radical conclusions because of all of this being seen. So
Right.
that's yeah,
Focus on being represented
yeah.
as like the end point to our politics itself.
And then
Yeah.
you're talking about so much, and this is why I really love. So some of my favorite parts are the discussions you have with the folk, like when you're doing your intern work and you're um. So if I cut you off, please,
No,
But
I'm thank you for your enthusiasm. That's
I,
really
I
it's
I
really great
love
to
the book.
hear.
I'm
Thank
just
you.
there's so many things we're not going to get to. I might if maybe I'll ask you to come back again because there's so
Sure.
many other little threads that I'd like to just really just talk.
Yes.
But in this one, I just want to introduce everybody as much as possible. Get and then maybe we'll do some more and get more folks to read it and they'll raise questions as well. But
Totally.
um, so for instance, just to come back to that point, and then we can I did ask you. Well, let me ask you the other question that I had intended initially. Then there's some other things that I wanted to come back because there's this the I'm just looking at my notes. The conversation you had about Black Panther and nuance, I want to come back
Mhm.
to in a second, but I'm just going to leave that there for a second.
Mhm.
Um, so I had wanted to ask, speaking of those racial constructs that these categories that were put in, what does it mean when the world's smallest segment, that is a ruling white elite, are defined as the mass audience, while the majority are the complicating factors, as you describe? And again, I saw that even in Biko's statement about, the press, like we know the press, even the Black press, is targeting a white audience, a white ideal, a white aesthetic, a standard, or definitions of race and all this. And then you're talking about in 2025 something very similar in terms of, again, who is this mass audience and who are the complicating factors.
Right. Yeah, my encounter with this idea of the general market what in an internship that I had in college was really set the set the spark for me wanting to really dig into um, the industry further. Because at first I thought, to you mentioned before, my kind of journey and understanding like where my place in this cultural industry of racial experts, there was a time where I felt like this was actually really great. Like I get to be an expert in my quote identity and have stable, seemingly well paid employment through that. That's really interesting. So that was partly what motivated my interest in actually doing the internship. It was first the curiosity in the kind of racial theorizing, and then the practical economic aspects of like I can get paid to be me and the false promises of that. But I opened the book with this scene that I had on the first day of my internship where I was brought into this kind of creative brainstorming meeting, and the team that was sitting around this table trying to figure out, I think, like how to get Hispanic men ages like, I don't know, 25 to 34 to think that this mid-sized sedan was cool or something like that. And I remember one of the account managers said this phrase very offhandedly, like, well, this consumer isn't like your average general market white consumer, and continues on with some other sentence. And I looked around the room like, what, that wasn't weird to anybody else. Like that was sort of, so it was in that moment that my burgeoning anthropologist hat came on and was like, okay, this is kind of a taken for granted understanding within this space that one, that there's a category called the general market that refers to some kind of group in advertising. First, just interested in me to want to dig more, but secondly, that whiteness and notions of generalness were tied together as synonymous. And so in the book, I kind of dig into this in a chapter, one of the first chapters, called The General Market, on the commercial construction of American whiteness. And what I talk about is this category of the general market that you hear get used in media agency pitches, between colleagues when they're talking about consumers. They're talking about human beings in the United States in particular, and the way that it functions in the industry discourse is in a variety of ways. So it's used as a shorthand to kind of mean everyone, right? The mass audience, which is even an outdated concept in and of itself in terms of just how media is consumed and being distributed these days. But in practice, in the industry, it has meant a very actually specific racialized person. The general market in American advertising industry lingo refers to a white, economically comfortable person who, by virtue of those identifiers, is then treated as the average American, as the normative human. And we know that this idea doesn't originate in advertising, it just gets reproduced there. It is a very concretely political and cultural conception of American citizenship that marketing has inherited and then reproduces in its language in the business infrastructure of advertising, because you have general market agencies and multicultural agencies. So there's that piece. And there's like the technical piece too of how advertising and like media is data obsessed. There's like cultural creativity obsession, but a lot of times that has to be supported by some kind of research to back it up, to back up any kind of creative decision. So the idea of the average or the norm is tied up, I think, with this statistical thinking and this the way that quantitative data sort of put on a pedestal in many ways, through measurement, through census categories, ratings, demographics. So the mass audience becomes this kind of group that's treated as the default and the safest investment. The group that's that is the most worth pursuing because they represent the majority. But I think that's where I observed in the work that I did and the people that I talked to, where specific conceptions of American whiteness, because I wanted to be careful and not just fall into the trap of saying that whiteness in the United States is this kind of like monolith. But what ends up happening in the advertising industry, the way that this term is used, it becomes this type of monolith that people don't really define, because whiteness is understood as this like obscure norm. And so because of that, everyone else is treated as niche or different or multicultural and therefore incremental and extra work. And so we know that this idea of whiteness as the norm, especially in how brands have conceptualized like the mass market, is so tied up with and I talk about in that chapter kind of mid 20th century kind of political economic shifts that made whiteness a predeterminant in who got access to credit, who got access to build wealth in terms of access to home loans, and how the racial wealth gap was stratified in that way through consumer culture. So the general market operates in the racial information system, and it kind of gets justified as a sort of economic and neutral term that's somewhat grounded in the facts that whites are the majority of the country. But we know that what I talk about in the book is how it's actually a racial formation, and we actually see people use the idea of general market in a racialized way in the work that is done in advertising in both sides of the business as well.
Yeah. Again, I can't stress enough how important your book, I think, is to a contemporary understanding of all of these intersections of race, um, advertising, colonialism, media, politics, and all of that. And I will say, at least I'll at least claim it, that I just said the word intersection on purpose, because I did want to ask you about your discussion of intersectionality. Um, Let me ask you this way. Uh, because in my notes, I wrote Crenshaw and Google equals Kaepernick and Nike question mark. And what I think I meant by that is that one of the only criticisms that I ever had of Colin Kaepernick's efforts with the NFL was when he ended up doing the Nike commercial, which I thought I understood. I could understand the logic on his end, but from what I think I understand about all of this, I took it as an ultimate net loss for his efforts, because he becomes part of the co-opted advertising uh, process. Just and it undermines, even unconsciously, people's association with him with radical politics and challenging powers that be. Um, and that's how I admit I interpreted what you were saying about what happens. What I That's how I interpret what you've written about Kimberly Crenshaw's intersectionality concept, and its, my word, corruption by the broader academic and corporate environment. So when you talked about, because I think you do a very important reminder of, this is what Kimberly Crenshaw, by the way, who preceded me by some years at the Africana Studies and Research Center at Cornell University, then headed by the late great founding director Dr. James Turner. I always like to shout him out, may he rest in power. But so I think it was great that you reminded us. Crenshaw was saying intersectionality was specifically initially about recognizing all the forces that negatively impact women of color, Black women in particular, starting, if correct any of this in a moment. But then there is something that happens to that concept in the broader academic punditry universe. And then there's another thing that happens to that in the advertising space, what the corporate world does with intersectionality and how they redefine that term and redeploy it. So then when you describe her, I think in 2016, that is Kimberly Crenshaw going and sitting with Google to talk about their deployment or definition or engagement, where she describes it as ultimately a positive in helping the world better understand and see the representation. Admittedly, I felt like that's where I felt like she unfortunately slipped into the Kaepernick Nike realm. So I'm not saying you're saying that. I'm saying I interpreted it that way, and I'm curious what you think about any of that, or what you are in fact saying that I missed, or obviously that you would have said better. Did that make
Oh,
sense? Am I
yeah,
making
no, that
sense?
no, that totally made
Okay,
sense. I
okay.
think, what I should admit at the outset is that the reason why, so you're referring to an excerpt from a panel that Kimberly Crenshaw was on, at the Ad Color conference. And the Ad Color conference has become the premier um, industry, entertainment, media, advertising industry conference for, quote, people of color in U.S. Entertainment media industry. So they have this conference every year, and the same year that Professor Crenshaw was speaking on a panel, so was I. So I like to point out, my participation, because I can to answer your question about how I try to, at least in the book, take give her the benefit of the doubt in how she has been positioning her institute, her work, her recognition of intersectionality's broader social power as a term that has become widely known outside of academia, and efforts that I've seen her make in strategically using that to get access to resources from corporations in order to uh, continue to do the extremely pioneering and important work that she's doing. So I wanted to recognize that fact, and also recognize that I saw myself speaking on a panel about the legacy. I'll say I was speaking about the legacy of racial segregation in advertising, um, on that panel, because of the value that I saw in being part of that conference and getting access to important decision makers, people who I think could help forward my research interlocutors. And so I could see putting myself in her shoes. Obviously, I've never had the honor of having a conversation with her, not yet. So I don't know what she was thinking of her strategy, but this is kind of how I was navigating that conference as a researcher and as a presenter, and how I can imagine someone of her stature who is recognized outside of academia as a pioneering thinker and intellectual and activist, to kind of use these opportunities, whether it's with the WNBA or with Gucci or with a conference like Ad Color and partnerships. I'm not sure if she's done any partnerships with Google. That was just the person that was facilitating that panel. So I tried to give her the benefit of the doubt, but what you'll see, what I observed during my internships, is the rising popularity of intersectionality as a term that means a lot of different things when it's used in the context of a brand strategy report, or as a way to describe a consumer population and why they do what they do. I think that what's interesting about I think advertising, and I kind of experienced the benefits of that, is that I don't think it's anti-intellectual. I think that since there's this desire to want to ground advertising media in some sort of like empirical truth and data and rigor, they look to academia a lot. They look to anthropology, they look to sociology, they look to history. People have probably read your books, honestly, to inform the social theories that they're producing. So it was no surprise to me that intersectionality has is popular within like the lingo of advertising. I think what I wanted to do in that chapter though was really focus my analysis on exactly how intersectionality was being defined and used. And what I found was that it wasn't in the way that at least I read Professor Crenshaw intended on understanding on defining it. What I found in my conversations and in presentations that we're trafficking in this word is that intersectionality becomes this synonym for diversity, or it becomes a filler word to describe an individual trait rather than kind of a description of a political structure, kind of like the compounding impacts of oppression that Professor Crenshaw was trying to get at. You'll hear intersectionality used in a way like, say, oh, this campaign is really intersectional because it reaches Black women and LGBT community at the same time. Or, this campaign is really intersectional and diverse. So it kind of gets peppered in this broader repertoire of lingo that is used to gesture at a kind of fine-tuned, fine-grained knowledge of important social concepts. But what it ends up doing is it completely individualizes intersectionality as kind of like a personal, like a personality trait, and it removes it from the structural critique that at least I read Professor Crenshaw intended on the term to have. So it's kind of traveled and lost meaning, but it's become, at least when I was doing my research, it was quite fashionable to refer to intersectionality in brand marketing presentations.
Oh, you have a bunch of examples here too. I mean, it's almost hilarious. And again, I'm not meaning to in the same way I wasn't meaning to overly condemn Kaepernick. I'm not saying anything about Crenshaw either, other than uh, just what I think ends up happening when people engage certain spaces, myself
Yes.
included, on much lower levels. But myself included, we end up sometimes co-opting ourselves, if I may say it that way, because you point out a little bit that you point out, for instance, that Crenshaw was aware, as she said, you cite her as saying at a conference, that in terms of popular feminist and other scholarship, that she described intersectionality as being gentrified, and
Mhm.
now no longer speaking to the women she was initially intending to be the subject. And then you demonstrate, not to put it in the way that I'm framing it here, but you end up, I think, showing that the industry is saying, "Oh no, great, you've given us." Just like, because I made the argument to your point, I've said the same thing. We all produce all this work, and we think we've done something wonderful. A handful of our peers and friends read it, maybe some others, and then with a lot of scholarship, they're the ones, the what I would consider my political enemies, seem to read it and study it and weaponize it against everybody. But then you talk about, Amazon's advertising division highlighted the potential of intersectionality to achieve both economic efficiency and emotional effectiveness by helping advertisers span multiple demographics with a single marketing initiative. So it's not that Crenshaw did something wrong. I'm saying that they've taken her concept, and then it just seems a little shady then on their part, that then they're going to invite her and say, "We're going to help you with your work to speak to us at a conference, whatever." Anyway, it's just it's
It's laden with contradictions, which was a lot of the personal work that I had to do as a researcher, and I think the gift and the curse of anthropology, besides all the really messed up history and kind of contemporary practices of anthropology. I think that the gift of it as a method is really, it's a fancy way of like having to make friends and hang out with people as a research methodology. That's what ethnography is to me. Don't, people will probably hate on me, but I think I say that because uh, I got to know a lot of these professionals, these like racial theorists in the industry, and I got to befriend them and learn about their moral and political, in their view, motivations for doing the work that they do. Obviously, scaffolded within this kind of capitalism first appeal to belonging, to dignity, to social justice, but nonetheless, in an industry that for so long has systematically excluded people who look like us from entering the industry, multicultural marketing as an industry developed because of that segregation and had to justify its value and its existence and its importance because of this um, ingrained racial segregation and discrimination. And so there's there's this sense of duty and importance and responsibility to rectify past and present wrongs that a lot of the folks that I interviewed and worked alongside saw their work doing as having very important interventions in the media production process and the advertising production process to, you know, intervene on stereotypes, to provide more substantive data to maybe change a brand manager or colleague's preconceived notion about, you know, a Latino soccer fan or something like that. So I bring that up to say, you know, I came to the work from a, as I mentioned when we started, this old personal sense of like angst and frustration with how I'm classified and confusion, and also this very palpable real experience of the seduction of our brand culture and how it impacts how I view myself. But what I saw with these workers, these executives in this doing this work, is like the meaning and the purpose that they give it. And we like to say it's complicated, it's messy, but I also wanted to do some work and kind of highlighting that, because within the realm of the work that they're doing, it's the racial theorizing has like a social justice bent to it, which I also found fascinating to see, like to play out, and how that also gets infused in the marketing presentations as well.
So I said, well, you said how you made reference to how we end up being represented. I want to draw a distinction between we on the screen here and to say that you did something else in this book that I quickly wanted to shout you out for and deeply appreciated, and selfishly proving or well, adding weight to my previous beliefs and arguments around the presentation of biracial and multiracial people in advertising. And I've said for a long time, I'm uh, I separate judgments and personal choices of partners from their depiction in popular media. And so while I'm not interested in commenting on people's choices with partners and interracial, so-called interracial relationships, I am very much interested in what I've noted as a prevalence and an increase in representation of interracial relationships and multiracial people as a part of what I think is a very counterinsurgent effort at rebranding the hostilities that still exist. So when I saw that you mentioned, and I hate that it had to be couched in an accurate, well, actually it was, I take that back. It was funny to see that it was a Biden, a reference to President Biden, who was ultimately being used here to prove me right, which is kind of a disturbance, to me. But just, you said here that, but rightly so, that Joe Biden highlighted the increasing presence of interracial couples in TV ads as a symbol of social progress, remarking, quote, "For those of you who are over 50, how often did you see advertisements on television with black and white couples? Today, 2 or 3 out of 5 commercials feature mixed race couples. That's not by accident. They're selling soap, man." So I said that's just bars, because one, you're right, it's not an accident. Two, you're saying the simple existence of interracial couples is an automatic net good for the world. And I think there's reasons to raise questions around why that's being said that way. And then you're saying also in that one statement, he's admitting we're using all of this and toying with all of your identities to sell soap for the same purpose as selling some soap.
Yes. Oh, that was my husband actually found that quote. So that was had to include that one in.
Salute
Yeah,
to
because
him.
it is really telling, and I think you are observing a very real phenomenon about the increase in representation of interracial couples on TV commercials, at least, and I'm sure there's been research done, kind of measuring it. I don't have anything to kind
There's
of
been I
cite
can't I can't
offhand.
I can't cite it off the top of my head, but we looked at some like a year ago that was that, and they were breaking down even to the they were part of the research was monitoring down to the second how much time was being spent on the representation of different couples in a commercial,
Oh,
and when there
wow.
was interracial couples how much time was spent and how each person in that relationship was framed,
Oh,
all
wow.
to give this. Yeah, so and it was all to support what you're saying here, that there's an intent here to project some sort of racial utopia that doesn't exist. That's my summary, at least.
There's that, and I think there's also, coming back to the demographic piece in the general market, there we are at like this inflection point with who the average American is, at least statistically, how it's being projected. And I think, this is my theory, that the increase of interracial couples has something to do with this, because as I was talking about earlier, we have this kind of legacy norm understanding, that white people racialized as white are the kind of demographic majority. Therefore, it kind of makes sense to, from a purely statistical standpoint, to claim that they are the mass market just from a number standpoint. But the 2010 census, and even starting from back in the 2000 census, there starts to be this rumbling about the oncoming of a majority minority, which, what a phrase, right? But majority minority nation by the 2040s. And so this is becoming like a new sort of like leverage point and challenge, I think, for an advertising industry business infrastructure that has been so built on a presumption of a white norm, to the point that there are separate agencies to reach the general market, everyone code white versus multicultural. Now there have been a lot of discussions and deliberations and reports around who the new general market is. And I talk about this in the book. There's been these inter-industry debates about, what do we call the general market? Is it the total market? Is it the cross-cultural market? How do brands and agencies reconceptualize, decenter whiteness from their conceptualization of the average American, when the entire business, so many business relationships, theories, softwares are kind of predicated on that norm? So I feel like the prevalence of interracial couples is sort of a play to start shifting the representations from what folks know is coming. So how do we still have white folks present in advertising, in mainstream advertising, but bring people of color into the frame on, television, which we can talk about how so much of advertising has changed, in a way that kind of eases the public, but also advertising as an industry, their practices and understandings around who just gets to get on TV and represent the mass market.
In fact, I think you touched on something that I gotta find that study we were looking at, because part of what
Yes.
what they were arguing was, to your point there, they were saying that they part of the monitoring of the time spent in the framing was we want the white woman, for instance, in this interracial relationship to be centered as creating still the standard of whiteness. And then her black husband and their beige child will still fade into the, in there in certain ways to let you know this is an interracial situation, multiracial. They got the biracial
Right.
kid, but the white is still, not terrifying white audiences too much is the way but I'll find it. And if I do, I'll definitely send it to you.
Please do.
So, um, before we wrap up, there's just a couple, um, well, two quick notes I wanted to mention. I don't know if because you talked about it even in your own childhood experience. It made me write down the I used to use it in my classes all the time, the documentary, The Corporation. And then there's this segment on the nag factor where they talk about advertising to kids to get their kids to nag for that item to their parents, to get the parents to end up going. So that was just one.
Oh, I have to check that out.
Yeah, it's the documentary is great for a number of reasons, but this section, you if you just Google corporation nag factor, the chapter will come up, and they talk to an advertising exec, and she's on camera saying, "Yeah, then she has a number. We know that you know 50% of sales of child targeted products wouldn't happen if they didn't if it wasn't the parent being nagged about something like that. So they measure that. And then they target advertising to get the kid to go to the parent to say, I want that, I need that, I need that, nag the parent to go
Mm.
buy the product. The other thing that I noted was that another documentary I used to use was called The Merchants of Cool.
Oh yeah, I know that.
um yeah, so and in that they talk about obviously the use of early adopting cool kids, which, as you've noted, are, I don't think the documentary did too much with this, but as you've noted, are often at least coded as the black kids are going to be the cool kids that are going to even make white kids buy stuff. And I wrote this next to under my note about the Black Panther conversation that what I've in my notes is Black Panther and nuance.
Hmm.
Could could you talk about could you if you remember the details of what you were saying there, and if I'm connecting these correctly, could you talk about what your conversation was like with, I forgot their name, but an exec or some ad rep who was doing something targeting black consumers, but it was connected to your conversation about the film Black Panther. At least
Yes,
in my note, if I okay, and then you led it into your discussion of what nuance means in the context of advertising.
for sure, for sure.
Okay.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
that vignette opens up. I forget the multicultural expertise chapter where I give an overview about my understanding of what multicultural brand strategists do as these type of in-house racial theorizers and experts within the ad agency and media agency context. So that vignette recounts a conversation that I had with a shopper marketing strategist who was really, really excited about a campaign that she was working on for some kind of, I think it was like a European alcohol brand. And they wanted to launch I think it was a wine brand, a Moscato or something like that. They wanted to launch in the US, and so they went to this agency to sort of figure out what their go to market strategy was. And she was really excited to tell them, like, hey, you should really launch this alcohol with Black millennials in Atlanta. And here's why. And she really excitedly showed me this very slickly designed presentation, again recalling those kind of stated facts and figures about entire populations of people that triggered me when I was in my mother's living room in Brooklyn. These very authoritative facts and figures about who Black millennials are, what they do, how they behave, these types of racial typologies, um, that was data that was gathered from publicly available social media data. So there are several different software companies that whole job is to collect and aggregate and organize feeds from public social media accounts. and put them in a dashboard, and then people like brand strategists can go in and say Coca-Cola and Black consumers, or like wine in Atlanta. Like, what are the conversations going on about these different topics, these brands? And so this kind of, we are all, if you have a public social media profile, unwitting participants in market research, because our information is being pulled, analyzed, our pictures. And I have done this as someone who has interned. Screenshots, pictures are being put into marketing presentations to substantiate whatever type of theory that a strategist has about what target population would be best. So the Black Panther reference comes from her the brand strategist kind of rationalization to the client about why Black millennials in Atlanta made the most sense to launch the brand. She was saying, Black consumers are, leading on the leading edge of culture in the US. If you think about, Black Panther and the way that Black Panther has redefined what a superhero could look like, it makes total sense that we position Black consumers as being able to redefine what this, alcohol means. I should add that the time of our conversation was right at the height of, the representation matters fever dream around Black Panther and Crazy Rich Asians, and this type of like this turning point that was being talked about in the popular press around where, sort of like blockbuster media entertainment was going in terms of, who was behind the lens, who was in front of it. So she used that as kind of part of her pitch to the company to say, hey, Black Panther is really culturally relevant. Black consumers are really relevant for your brand too. So I use that moment, that experience I had, to talk about this kind of term that I also saw be used constantly within the agency spaces to refer to the type of expertise that multicultural brand strategists saw themselves as performing in corporate America. And it was referred to as nuance, that they brought expertise about nuance. And the term nuance was used as a synonym almost for like racial difference, and the types of information and details about cultural practices, about likes and dislikes, that could be lost if a brand did not invest in the right types of information and experts to do the digging. And what I think was most telling about the popularity and the use of the word nuance as in the way that these professionals talked about their work is because there was like an economic value tied to nuance, or the lack of it, in a brand strategy or in a campaign. So if a brand missed out on the opportunity for a nuanced take on why Latina moms like Bounty, then they were leaving X amount of dollars on the table. So therefore, racial expertise in Latina moms was actually a driver in getting Bounty to make those sales that it wanted and it needed. So I was seeing this kind of commodification of like racial theorizing and insight that I found really fascinating and important, and it made me think back to, historically, just the echoes of racial science in contemporary advertising. Folks in anthropology were measuring skulls and bones, saying that there were these kind of definitive differences in between groups. Marketers are measuring clicks, measuring race, reifying it, making it real through measurement. I was seeing the echoes of it through this work of multicultural brand strategy. And what I wanted to do with the book was really place advertising within this ongoing legacy of racial science, because it hasn't left us. It continues, it is evolved, and its methods and ways that it's put to use have changed, but they remain with us. And I argue in the book, they are present in the work of advertising.
And you've done such a good job in making your argument. So I
Thank
encourage people again to
you.
check out the
I
book.
appreciate that.
So my last question then, just building off of that, is your last point then is, a lot of the people that will watch this are organizers and activists, and I am wondering, given this discussion and some others that we've been having lately, what does your argument say then about the effectiveness as race as an organizing tool?
Hmm. So I think that's a really good question because I feel like it depends on like what we mean by effective and like to what end. So I think in one sense, yes, like racial theorizing, this way that we've been all socialized to understand our humanity and understand other people, it's been incredibly effective. It's effective as a cultural conceptual shortcut, a kind of shorthand to make order of complexity. It gives people, institutions this kind of quick way to sort and slot and pre-assign meaning. It allows us to look at someone and say, I know who you are. I know where you belong. So in and of itself, that kind of organizing, that I think that kind of powerful cognitive function demonstrates the effectiveness of racism as a political infrastructure and race as the kind of way of understanding what it means to be human that's kind of been produced from it. Of course, through brute force and violence. So I'm not claiming that, conceptions of racial difference is simply this kind of like intellectual research and measurement exercise. Like that's what I'm arguing is that that's kind of part of the violence and domination in many ways is how knowledge, media, and entertainment are part of this kind of like steady flow of information that we receive that reinscribe these categories so that they become like common sense. So in that sense, the self-evidentness of racial classifications have proven themselves very effective. But I think that there's another side to the question that again is tied to like my own personal, maybe navel gazy, but like, hey, I'm an anthropologist, struggles or questions about like who I am and where I belong, because ultimately these conceptions are categories and they're only effective because they flatten people. They're only effective because they simplify. And so that's where I think, to my understanding, there's always opacity, there's always unknowability, even though our taken for granted conceptions of racial difference have kind of oversold the promise that it gives about like explaining who people are. So I think that we see this dynamic play out all the time, but in marketing, it's pretty stark because the very invention of the Hispanic classification on the U.S. Census in 1980 is so deeply tied to the Spanish language media industry and their desire and to want to have a kind of official category recognized by the state to groups of people from many different countries around the world into one category and say, hey, they may be Puerto Rican, Dominican, and Mexican, but they all have inherently shared cultural traits. And as Univision, which was one of the media networks at the time that was very much involved in helping kind of market the to help get the word out about the census category, they had an interest in the Hispanic category being made official so that they could say, hey, there are X amount of Hispanics. We have this unified, contained population of people that by virtue of them being Hispanic, we can predict and claim certain things about them. So I say all that to say that at the same time, the Hispanic category, which has been sort of like my rub, my like my fight for life, the selling point becomes, there's people from a bunch of different nationalities, but they're also treated as they have these kind of shared traits. So there's diversity within it, but there's commonalities, and that rationality in the chaos is what really matters to advertisers. Like, how can you make people make sense? How can you make people predictable so that we know what they want, or we could predict what they want so that our advertising can appeal to who we think they are? But at the cost of that, like, I think, false sense of effectiveness, there's so much that it gets erased, that my goal with the book was to try to reveal those types of processes that often get this sheen of authority because we've been trained to see, I think, quantitative data, especially, as having this type of mystique of truth, when really there's a lot of storytelling and subjective. I don't know why the word sorcery is coming to my mind behind it. So effective and then grossly ineffective is what I would say. And I hope that organizers and folks who are listening here read the book if you so desire. And yeah, I think it just reinforces the need for continual education, political education about the political and historical construction of racial categories. I think that that's such an important part of the work that we need to continue to do, because I think in many ways we're still living with Linnaean ideas about racial difference from like the 1700s, where people think that like you have essential racial traits that propel you to behave in a certain way. And that legacy is part of the reason why I wrote this book too, to try to talk about how some of the most seductive and powerful parts of our media environment are part of reproducing those very powerful misconceptions and how we understand who we are.
Marcel Rosa-Salas, thank you very much for the book.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for the time,
I
and
appreciate you.
you definitely going to hear more from me. We're going to have to run some of this back, and we're going to have to start with
Yes.
how Univision created the Hispanic community.
It's something I like to talk about. I would love to speak about that further. So thank you so much for the
Yeah.
opportunity. Truly, like, your work has been such an important part of shaping my own thinking too. So this feels like a really just cool opportunity to get to meet you and be in
No,
conversation. So thank you for this opportunity.
no, the honor was mine. I mean, as I told you, I mean, I got the Google alert that showed my name in association with your book, and that's how and I was honored to see that, and I was honored by how good your book is, and then I'm also honored that I appear in it as I appropriately should, as sort of peppered in just a little bit in a collage of other thinkers that you've built from, all in service of what your great contribution here. So
Thank
it's all
you.
perfect,
I
and thank you very
appreciate you.
much. The
Thank you
link to
so
get the
much.
book will be in the show description, and yeah, peace to you, because I know you're fighting
Yes.
for it, as Fred Hampton used to say. And I will catch you another time right here at I
Yes.
Mix What I Like.
Yes.
Thank you.
Peace. Talk to you later.
I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like.